This week on To the Contrary.
First, the Planned Parenthood defunding movement. Then, how sexism is or isn't affecting American politics. Behind the headlines, why the rate of women in federal and state prisons is growing.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, defunding Planned Parenthood.
A group of 28 Republican House members, all men, are threatening a government shutdown unless Congress defunds Planned Parenthood. Republicans held congressional hearings with testimony this week from two people who said they were born after their mothers had failed abortions, but no Planned Parenthood officials were invited. This anti-Planned Parenthood surge is not supported by all Republicans. Many fear if the hard right succeeds in shutting down the government again, the party will look bad and lose critical support from moderates and women. The government's fiscal year ends at the end of this month. This surge was driven by the secretly filmed, heavily edited videos which Republicans say show Planned Parenthood involved in selling fetal tissue. Planned Parenthood says the tissue was donated legally for medical research to find cures for critical ailments such as cancer and Parkinson's disease.
So, Congresswoman Norton, as you know better than any of us here, about a third of Planned Parenthood's funding comes from the government. Although none goes for abortion, none of that government funding goes for abortions, goes for things like cervical cancer screenings. Will this surge succeed?
Well, Bonnie, the annual defund Planned Parenthood carnival has begun. It's a little more serious this time, but it will not succeed.
I think, Bonnie, if we were really concerned about funding organizations and clinics that can help women, there's a much better way to do it than giving those dollars to Planned Parenthood, and that's what we ought to be discussing.
I would say this is not going to be successful. It's sort of like defunding Planned Parenthood as the new black of partisan politics. I think this is more pre-political season saber-rattling than any sort of genuine commitment.
I think not right now. They won't succeed, but down the road I think there will be some compromise made on this in terms of funding, because there's a kind of a growing movement about trying to keep federal tax dollars from the kind of things we saw in those videos.
Well, you know, why is it that, I'm just curious, that all 28 of these representatives are male? Because, and I'll say this because the anti-abortion forces have gotten very smart about finding women to run their organization, so it looks like, you know, women support them. But why can't they? There are plenty of conservative women in the House. Where are they?
Well, and I'll say, I mean, there's plenty of women who support pro-life organizations, so that these are not front people that are heads of them. Look, I think you're going to probably see more women sign on. I was just chairing an event on the Hill this week where Vicky Hartzler from, I think, Missouri, a Republican woman, could not have been more vocal in her belief that Planned Parenthood ought to be defunded. And my guess is she'll be vocal on the floor, and she'll probably sign on to letters and legislation and the like.
But why hasn't she until now?
Well, they just got back. I don't know. But my guess is you're going to have a lot more
names. But this is not a new issue.
It's not a new issue, but Congress has been out. And so this is something that's now they're taking up. And I think you're going to see a lot of Republican women come out and say that they are opposed to funding federal tax dollars for
But you're touching on something that's really important. Republicans have this problem. If they want to get their message out, then they line themselves up without one single female. Why don't they say, hey, wait, you know, this isn't really going to look very good for us? And what it does is it feeds into this really important line that their opponents have, which is that men are trying to control women's reproductive rights. It works in election years. I know from talking to voters, they're always worried about that when they try to pick a candidate. And I think it hurt Mitt Romney back when he was running for president. Women were saying, I don't think I want to elect him. I'm worried about what he'll do. Will he try to take away my birth control? And of course, he wasn't going to do that. But it's the drumbeat that the opponents of Republicans on this issue have. And it works.
Make no mistake, the Republican women are right there. Strategically, they made a mistake. But you're absolutely right. With almost all women's issues, equal pay for equal work, you name it, they stick with the men. They are very often, they miss extraordinary opportunities, certainly opportunities to make some hay with independent women by not having a voice of their own. And they have virtually no voice.
But,
they're one of the boys.
You couldn't ask for a better canary in the coal mine kind of optic, right? If we look at, again, I'm going to stand on my soapbox for a second, right? So as we've had this sort of gradual increase of Democratic women representing us in Congress, you've had an equal and very, very disastrous decline of Republican women representing us. So now this sort of 18% flatline number we've got is largely Democratic. That is a problem. We need more Republican women, conservative, moderate, and in between. So in truth, I think this is a real canary in a coal mine. We have a unique paucity of conservative Republican women, period, representing us. And so I agree with you, Susan. I think this is a strategic mistake on the part of the Republican Party.
But my point is this: if as Genevieve pointed out, there are Republican women who want to defund Planned Parenthood, but they're not joining with these guys in this movement.
Well, but
is it because they know that they're going to lose women's votes?
I'm saying two things. I'm saying, number one, you don't have enough Republican women to start with. They've got to keep their powder dry and pick their issues. Number two, there seems to be the sort of, Susan, your point, Congresswoman, there seems to be a little bit of ham-handedness when it comes to the optics of this in the Republican Party itself. Not intentional, but it's a mistake. It's a mistake.
Well, strategically, I don't think they get it. I mean, there's a few who do, but I think a lot of they are quite challenged. I mean, if you go back to the partial birth abortion ban, I will never forget George Bush signing that, and everybody standing behind him was a guy, a white guy, I might add. And I remember looking at it thinking, like, who's in charge of this, And it's very frustrating, frankly, as somebody to me, that the discussion we're having really, to me, is not the discussion we ought to be having. We ought to be talking about the issue of what Planned Parenthood's been doing, how tax dollars are appropriated.
Or what about the discussion that Mitch
it turns into are women for or against, and it's like women, as with most issues, are on both sides.
What about the discussion that Mitch McConnell, very conservative Senate Majority Leader from Kentucky, is having, which is, guys, don't do this. We don't want to shut down the government again.
Could I get in here for a moment? Because that is what I think the Republican women, where I think the Republican women are. Ted Cruz is over in the Senate saying, let's shut down the government over Planned Parenthood. Now, the women are going to be there when it comes to the votes. But this is not, this time, just about women. This is coming on to an election year, and a presidential election year at that. This is also about shutting down the government, and there is no doubt about who would get blamed because they are the one that issued the threat.
And if I could just point out, it was the women on both sides of the aisle that turned that situation around last time. They got together and they said, oh, boys, knock off. Right, the fifth grade shenanigans. Let's get this passed. So
yeah, but see, this is where we are coming up against a funding deadline, and I think it's really bad politics for Republicans to think there's no way they could come out and say, we're going to fund the government, we're going to defund Planned Parenthood, and let the president say, I'm going to shut down everything else in Washington. I'm going to shut down sending out Social Security checks. I'm not going to fund our military because I'm so beholden to Planned Parenthood, especially when Republicans, they don't want to get rid of these dollars. They want to give them to other federally qualified clinics that actually serve more women than Planned Parenthood.
If you could possibly sell to the American,
it's about taking money away.
Genevieve, if you could sell to the American public that this is something that President Obama did, you would be the richest PR person in Washington D.C.
If they came out and said it, no. If they came out and said it right, if they came out and said it correctly, which is we want to defund Planned Parenthood. Everything else gets defunded, or everything else gets funded. What does the president say?
Or what?
They didn't have to use the word shut down.
Well, they have used the word,
and which is a mistake.
But they use the word because that's what they mean. He who shuts down, she who shuts down the government gets the blame. I don't know how many times Republicans have to shut down. I don't know how many times. I don't know how many times Republicans have to take the blame for shutting down the government to get that strategic point, and they still don't get it. And Ted Cruz has already said it. So you should have gotten to him about a month ago.
I would agree they should use the language.
As some might say, despite all Republicans knowing this is not a good idea, the war on women seems to be continuing. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnier Bay. From Planned Parenthood to a question of sexism.
Donald Trump says he never meant Carly Fiorina's looks make her unelectable. That's his response to the controversy over a Rolling Stone magazine quote this week. The actual quote is, "Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?" Fiorina says she won't spend any time wondering what Trump meant. But Hillary Clinton, who's been losing ground to Bernie Sanders, says she'd love to debate one particular candidate who just seems to delight in insulting women. With Clinton's drop in the polls and the Trump comments, we are wondering how deep is sexism in politics and in American society today.
So, Sam, we'll get to the part about Donald Trump and his remarks in a minute, but as you have frequently said to me, is sexism just still completely deeply rooted in American culture and society?
It's the number one reason we're ranked 97th in the world in the number of women in elected office, behind Cuba and Afghanistan. And in my upcoming book, Ascend, we talk a lot about this. But when I ran for Congress myself in 2008, in my local Tribune paper, on the front of the paper, so my children could see it every day when it landed on the doorstep, here's the quote, I'll edit it. Sammy Bennett is a phony political, WH asterisk asterisk asterisk, who gives good, HEA asterisk. Even her PU asterisk 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 is made of plastic. And even FU asterisk asterisk asterisk, Mother Teresa would agree that her PU asterisk 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 is made of plastic. And I was like, what is going on here? I've been a corporate executive. I thought I'd seen everything. It turns out I hadn't seen anything at all in the wild and woolly world of American politics. So when I came to Washington, we did this research called Name It, Change It. Gloria Steinem named it for us. And here's the bottom line of the research. Women's appearance is talked about all the time when they run for office. And as soon as you start talking about their appearance, they drop electorally like a stone by 12 points. Boom, game over. But as long as the woman responds, she gains all the lost votes. So here's where Carly Fiorina is making a strategic mistake. I'm a big admirer of hers. Fortune 20, first woman to break that ceiling. Very competent, very capable. But she should be saying that's sexist, and you wouldn't say that to any man. And as soon as she does that, she regains all the lost votes. Now, Hillary Clinton has had a big target on her back ever since she entered politics. And she also has not handled this. Why? When I ran for Congress, all the national trackers that were following in my race said, Sam, don't respond to that. You're only going to amplify it. Turns out they were dead wrong. The research shows you must respond, and that's what all American women need to do, including Hillary.
Maybe she's saving it for the debate this coming week.
Yes,
she wants to do it where everybody's watching, and she's going to let him have it. Look, I don't think there's any doubt that women get more. I mean, look at all the way people talked about Palin in the past. They talked about Hillary's pantsuits and so forth. But you know, people do talk about Donald Trump's hair, and nobody calls that sexist,
right? But when I think about,
but it doesn't impact
talking
him.
About the deeply,
it doesn't.
Nothing impacts. Nothing impacts his hair.
When I think about deeply rooted sexism, I think to the point where nobody is in this, or very few people in this country, or even if it's half, are going to take seriously any woman candidate for president. In other words, race, we've gotten largely past the race barrier, at least on the national level, in terms of political candidates, but we are nowhere near past the sex barrier.
I saw some recent polling out just this past week that Carlin Bowen over at the American Enterprise Institute put out, showing that actually the majority of men and women in this country would vote. Large majorities would vote for a woman for the presidency. And it's changed a lot. If you look back 25 years ago, 50 years ago, you took that same question. So I think we've made a lot of progress. It's not perfect, but I do not think that's Hillary Clinton's biggest problem right now. I mean, Hillary started out very strong out of the gate, just as she did back almost 8 years ago now. And the problem has not been anybody talking about her hair or talking about what she's wearing or talking about what she looks like. They've been talking about her honesty and trustworthiness and an email scandal. And that's why her numbers have been falling. I do not think it's because she's a woman. I don't think that's been the debate at all around Hillary.
Well, in truth, though, research shows that when women run out of the gate, voters see them as more trustworthy. Boom. Doesn't matter what woman it is. And the problem is voters don't see them as leaders. What's been happening in this sort of very carefully calculated mechanism is they've been eroding her perceived trustworthiness. The biggest advantage she's got, I would say, it's absolutely sexist.
But again, whether this, one thing Hillary has to do is to correctly diagnose this. And I can't sit here as someone who is rooting for her and say that the email mistake, which she now calls it, was all because I was a woman. I can't say that if a man had made that mistake, he would be treated the same way. But I think she would be in deep trouble if she then came out and said, you know what, if I was a man, this wouldn't matter.
No, of course, I'm not talking about her saying it, but just how much of it is, you know, I mean, if Joe Biden had a private email account as vice president, would this redound to hurt him as badly, or is it because of sexism, or is it because she still hasn't released all the emails?
Yes, you see, what you're hitting upon are the many ways, and sexism may be buried in there, but and it's hard to believe that it isn't somewhere. But what you got to look at is how high she was before and this fall, and when you get, you know, when you get Bernie Sanders ahead of her now in Iowa and New Hampshire. A self-critical diagnosis is necessary, factoring in the fact that she is a woman and therefore breaking entirely new ground.
It's also that she's a Clinton, and I think there's been a growing or enduring mistrust of the Clintons that goes back decades, obviously, and that's set the stage, I think, for this to explode, this email situation to really explode into what it is right now and how dangerous.
Well, one of the worst indications of it is that she gets blamed for his infidelity. I've heard that
and if that isn't sexist,
her.
I don't know what is.
That is
right?
straight out.
And as a passionate Hillary Clinton person, again, the research that we did, extensive research, very expensive, long-ranging research. We turned this upside down and sideways and frontways with Name It, Change It. What it shows, there's absolutely no downside to calling it out for what it is, sexist. There's no downside at all. And once you do, voters go, oh, you're right, that's sexist. And they blame the opponent. So I think there's still the sort of old political water cooler wisdom that has been untested and unproven that says that we need to ignore this stuff. In truth, you need to respond to it.
Final words.
Well, I'd say for Hillary Clinton, she obviously can't use that for reasons that Congresswoman Norton said. She can't say this is because I'm a woman. But for Carly Fiorina, I think you're right. I think she could have come back and said, why are you talking about how I look? This is about how to lead the country. Instead, she said, well, I'm not going to really go out, you know, I'm not going to address that. So I think that's really an interesting way to kind of break apart what is sexism for each candidate, and really, is it about looks? Is it about treatment? You know, it's hard to read between the lines sometimes.
All right, behind the headlines. As the movement to release nonviolent offenders from prison grows, the focus will not just be on men. In fact, the rate of women being imprisoned in the U.S. is growing faster than that of men.
More than 100,000 women are in federal or state prison. That's an increase of 500% since 1980. One organization working to reverse that trend is the Sentencing Project.
We work to promote alternatives to incarceration and also look at issues such as racial disparity and other issues that impact criminal justice policy in the United States.
Female prisoners often have histories of physical and sexual abuse, high rates of HIV infection, and substance abuse. Nicole Porter says 1 million women in the U.S. are under some form of criminal justice supervision due to policies such as mandatory minimums and strict habitual offender laws.
These policies result in people going to prison for things that they just don't simply go to prison for. In other parts of the world, it results in the U.S. having the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Women are mostly incarcerated for drug and property offenses, and that tracks with an escalation of drug enforcement since the 1980s that many people refer to as the war on drugs.
1/3 of women in prison broke drug laws, and that's increasing at nearly double the rate for men. According to Porter, some of these women are doing time because of the so-called girlfriend problem.
The girlfriend problem is the recognition that many of the women who have been arrested for drugs and sentenced to prison for drugs are there because they weren't willing to give more information on a romantic partner who was involved in a more serious part of the drug trade.
As the number of women in prison on drug offenses has risen, there's also been a decline in racial disparities among female inmates.
We think that that's related to a change in arrest patterns.
The Sentencing Project believes in alternatives to incarceration, which the project says produce better outcomes.
Programs that address the underlying structural issues that impact high incarceration communities, particularly communities such as African American communities or Latino communities. And if there is an intention to focus programs on women, then those employment programs to alleviate poverty and hopefully reduce arrest for women in high incarceration neighborhoods would result in structural employment programs.
Porter says alternative programs also benefit the children who won't be separated from their mothers by incarceration.
So, Genevieve, there's a huge movement going on to reform the justice system and let a lot of nonviolent prisoners out because we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world and the most prisoners in the world. Why, since women they're more percentage-wise nonviolent female offenders in prison than men, why aren't we talking about releasing more women nonviolent?
Well, I think for anybody who's really involved in the criminal justice reform movement, there is discussion about some of that. I mean, I think you're right. Look, this is talking about a bipartisan issue. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing this on Capitol Hill, but it's also happening at the state level. There's nothing like a real problem to focus people's attention, and we've got so many people in prison, federal and state. They're so overcrowded. It's finally people woke up and we've got to do something about this. I mean, the U.S., I think we have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the incarcerations around the world. I mean, that just tells you how huge of
right. But you have to ask, where did this come from? You know, Congresswoman Norton, I know you can recall what Washington D.C. was like during the crack epidemic in the 1980s. The war on drugs was in partly a response to what happened in D.C. and in South Florida and other parts of the country where drugs took over and people couldn't walk down the street without worrying about getting killed. I mean, it kind of trickled up from drugs and other low-level crimes to other bigger problems in the community. That's where it came from. So I guess the problem now is there is this bipartisan effort, and the president led the way with those earlier pardons this year of drug offenders, looking at the sentencing laws, the length of time for these drug offenses. But you don't want to go so far that you've got the drugs on the streets again that lead to the bigger crimes and ruin these communities. I think that's the crossroads that we're at right now.
You have to be very careful.
Exactly.
We've got to be careful because we're seeing an uptick in crime throughout the United States, particularly in the big cities. But it is certainly true that when you look at the reasons why women are in prison, you know that there's something you could do about it right away. The reasons, I think, to get to your first question, well, women have just not been off the table. And I've been working on this and looking at black men, for example, but not nearly as closely at black women. It's because of the usual comparison. We are so small in number compared with the much larger number at every level of men in prison that our small numbers have hurt us. So nobody wants to look at us until they find these disparities, especially these disparities based on color. And now we see something really surprising, that the numbers based on color, at least the disparities based on color, are beginning to go down, and that puts the white women who were lower before at least looking like they are a worse problem. When you look behind that, once again, drugs. It's just a different kind of drug.
Well, what about this girlfriend issue? I mean, essentially it's women not wanting to, sorry for the vernacular, but rat out their boyfriends. Well, you know, do men rat out their not girlfriends, but their co-conspirators at a higher rate than women rat out their boyfriends? And if so, do prison counselors, do lawyers need to do something about this to inform women? Listen, you don't want to go to jail or you don't want to go to jail for 10 years when you could go for 3 if you give them information on your boyfriend.
Well, clearly there's a cultural phenomenon, right, at play. And but if I could veer off that just for a moment, something I don't hear from the Sentencing Project, and I think some of the work is exciting, and I don't hear from the sort of bipartisan effort, there's an underlying, one of the most significant commonalities between all incarcerated individuals, both male and female, is the extraordinary high rate of sexual abuse they've all experienced in their lives. And so for what it's worth, I would love to see the Sentencing Project, I would love to see this bipartisan effort include that in this sort of approach to this problem, because there is no other commonality like sexual abuse that binds these incarcerated individuals together.
Well, you know, is Congress in any way going to think about revisiting the sentencing guidelines?
This is really important. That we do have a real bipartisanship on this issue. One of the issues that have brought Republicans to the table, frankly, is cost. And they're cutting everything in sight, and they see, well, wait a minute, do we really need to put people in jail for 15 and 20 years simply for use of a substance? That's a status offense.
Well, and
that's not because of something you did nearly so much as being hooked on something.
Yeah. And is it working? And what we've seen is it's not working. And what you're seeing is Pew did a study on this, looking at the top 10 states that actually started letting people out earlier and had less incarcerations. Their crime rate fell compared to the 10 that were upping their incarceration. Now, we need to study that further, but that's a big finding. That's a big finding.
All right, and we'll keep looking at it. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.